Okay, so by my computer clock, it's telling me that it's just gone 12:05. So I'd like to welcome Anna Prince to the seminars today. Thank you very much for joining us, Anna, and we're really looking forward to hearing about your residential. Thank you.
Hi, so I'm Anna. I'm a speech and language therapist working for the Stammering Service in Bristol and South Gloss, and I work for Sirona Care and Health. And I recently completed a master's in clinical research, and I'm just really pleased to be here to share the outcomes of my research with you today. So I completed a feasibility study of the Fluency Trust residential Teens Challenge course. So a feasibility study being research that is conducted before the main study to answer the question, can this main study be done? So we weren't looking at effectiveness of the intervention, but we were laying the groundwork for a future study. We could go to the next slide, please. So I was lucky enough to attend this beautiful setting in North Devon to conduct my research, which is slightly more scenic than our clinic room in Bristol. And these are the organisations that I worked with. So I did my master's at the University of Plymouth. The master's was funded by the NIHR, and I worked really closely with the Fluency Trust Speech and Language Therapists and Bristol Speech and Language Therapy Research Unit to design and conduct the research. Next slide. The course aims to develop young people's confidence in communicating and positive attitudes towards speaking. It helps young people to develop problem solving and solution building skills, and also flexible thinking skills, as well as giving young people strategies to manage stammering in a helpful way. Next slide. So just thinking about the course structure, the Teens Challenge course is for young people aged 12 to 17 years of age. Young people and parents attend an assessment day in Swindon at the start of July. And then 3 weeks later, young people spend 5 days at an outdoor activity centre in North Devon. And each day they complete 3 outdoor activities like surfing, kayaking, climbing, and 5 hours of group therapy, which is based on the Swindon therapy packs. So it's a mixture, it's a complex intervention. It's a mixture of solution-focused brief therapy, acceptance and commitment therapy, cognitive behavioural therapy, and some strategy-based speech modification strategies. Parents attend 2 group sessions at the start and the end of the residential week as well. And then 9 weeks after the residential, young people and parents attend a follow-up day in Swindon. So next slide, please. So the overall structure of the research looked like this. Referrals for the course came in from all over the country. And then at the assessment weekend, we recruited participants, took our first set of outcome measures. I then attended the residential week to observe the sessions and to monitor intervention fidelity. So that's the extent to which the intervention delivered matched the intervention that was planned, and to monitor if there were any adverse events that occurred. The speech therapists and I actually took part in a lot of the outdoor activities ourselves alongside the young people. So that's me doing the bridge jump there on the right hand side. So if you look closely, you can probably see the look of sheer terror on my face at that point. And then at the post-course assessment day, we took the final outcome measures. And at that point, I also conducted semi-structured interviews with the young people to find out about their experiences of the course. And I also conducted interviews with the speech and language therapists who ran the course as well, to find out about their views on taking part in the research and their views on future research. Next slide, please. The outcome measures we used were the solution-focused brief therapy scales for young people and parents. So we had a separate scale for each of them. For this, they identify their best hopes, and then they indicate where they are in relation to those best hopes from 0 to 10 before and after the course. So 10 being that their best hopes have been met, and 0 being the opposite of that. We use the OASIS, which is a standardised measure, which is the overall assessment of the speaker's experience of stuttering. And young people rate themselves in the areas of general information about stammering, speakers' reactions, daily communication, and quality of life. And we also use the progress questionnaires, again, separate ones for young people and parents, where young people and parents rate themselves from 0 to 10 in 5 areas, with higher scores being desirable. So the areas are confidence in communicating, feelings about talking, ability to manage stammering, ability to solve problems, and to use flexible thinking. So next slide, please. So these are the outcomes, and it's really important to acknowledge at this point that it's certainly not an effectiveness study. We didn't have a control group, so we can't say the intervention is effective, but it just helps to give us an idea of the kind of impact that the intervention may have. I've presented the medians here. So for the progress questionnaire young person, young people moved from 28.5 out of 50 to 37 out of 50. So that was a positive shift of 8.5 points. Yeah, on the solution focused brief therapy scales, young people moved from 4.8 at the initial assessment to 8 out of 10. So that's a positive shift of 3.2. And then on the OASIS total impact score, at the initial assessment day, young people were moderate impact, and they moved 1 bracket to mild to moderate impact. The next slide, please. For the parents, for their progress questionnaires, they moved from 25 out of 50 at the initial assessment day to 39 out of 50 at the follow-up day. So that's a positive shift of 14 points. And then they moved from 4.8 to 8.8 at the follow-up day, so a shift of 4. Next slide, please. So the feasibility outcomes were really good. We had all 12 young people and all 12 parents and 2 speech and language therapists running the course who were eligible, and they were recruited to the study. And all participants completed the study, so we had no one withdraw over the time period. We had outcome measure completion that was 100%, and intervention fidelity was 95%. So there were only really small changes made to the course content. There were no adverse events, and that included me jumping off that bridge. I managed to come out unscathed, so that was always good. And the speech and language therapists were really pleased to be part of the research, and they said that participation did require some additional work, but it was manageable. Next slide, please. So moving on to the qualitative results, I completed individual semi-structured interviews with all 12 young people 9 weeks after the residential. And I used thematic analysis to generate the main sub-themes, which are on the left, and then the main themes, which are on the right here in this diagram. So there was a sense of togetherness that permeated the interviews. There was this sense of the group sort of coming together in a really supportive and an understanding way, with lots of young people feeling like they weren't alone in their stammering anymore. Young people spoke of strong bonds developed on the course, and one person described it as almost like another family. Young people inspired each other to try new things and to challenge themselves, both in the therapy and in the outdoor activities as well. They all spoke of increased confidence following the course. So they built up, towards the end of the course, they built up to do a questionnaire with the public. And one young person said they just really didn't think that they would be able to do that before going on the course. And all young people showed a new willingness and determination to engage in new or challenging speaking situations after the course. So for example, one young person said that before the course, he would always get his friends to buy his cinema tickets for him, but after the course, he would go up to the booth and he would do that himself. One young person talked about the benefits of stammering and felt that it was a good conversation starter and that stuttering makes people interesting. And some young people expressed a new enjoyment of speaking as well. So one young person said that before the course, he really didn't like public speaking, but actually after the course, he enjoyed it. There was a sense of freedom as well expressed by young people. So some talked about how stammering shouldn't hold them back in life, and they had the freedom to do what they wanted, for example, in terms of career. And some of the young people had harnessed the cool and helpful thoughts that were presented on the course, and they spoke of changes in outlook and in thinking. So one young person said that after the course, he had a brighter outlook on things. So if something unexpected happened, he could think, well, it's different to how I thought it would be, and I can adjust and things can change over time. So he'd really taken on board the flexible thinking and resilience strategies from the course. Gaining knowledge about stammering allowed young people to understand how to help themselves and where to focus their efforts and just to understand stammering more. And one young person felt empowered to educate other people about stammering and to tell them what they could do to help her after the course. And young people also felt equipped with new skills to manage stammering. So whether that was focusing on using different communication skills or using the cool and helpful thoughts and flexible thinking or using speech strategies. So I just wanted to give some quotes from the young people because that's really what brings it to life. So if we could go to the next slide, please. And so I realised my stammer shouldn't hold me back. Next slide. It's nice to know that you can kind of do anything. You've conquered the course, so you can conquer anything else. I didn't really know what a stammer was, so it's helped me describe it better to people, then tell them what helps. Yeah. Before, if I got stuck, I would just get stuck, but now I can use all of the techniques. It's helped me to express my views in school because I know I have a say and I'm just as important as everyone else. It's okay to stammer. Beforehand, I hated talking, and now I actually like it. I won't feel ashamed of who I am. I won't feel ashamed of my stammer. So it was just really fantastic to hear young people's voices during this project, and there were some really poignant quotes there and that really help us to begin to understand some of the impacts of the course. And so overall, there were lots of positive outcomes from the course, which has told us that further research is certainly warranted to help determine if the intervention is effective. I'm currently applying for further funding to complete more research into the course. So just thinking about the clinical implications, some of the clinical implications are around really the value of group work and meeting other young people who stammer, which can be really powerful for the group. Learning about stammering is clearly really helpful, which it just helps young people to understand stammering, and then also to educate others about stammering and how to help and support other young people who stammer. Presenting young people with a range of therapy options and approaches just helps and allows them to choose what works for them. And practical activities were really helpful, and that's what young people really said that they valued on the course. So things like giving presentations and completing questionnaires with the public were really valued by the course participants. And then exploring the benefits of stammering, I feel, just helps shift to a narrative where stammering is valued as a positive and different way of communicating. So next slide, that's it for my presentation. Thank you for listening. My email is there and my Twitter handle and the website for the Fluency Trust and their social media Twitter handle there. So if you want to get in touch, then please do. So if there are any questions, I'll be happy to try to answer.
Thank you very much, Anna. That was fantastic. What a great way to do research. Residential, must keep that one in mind.
Note for future.
That's really great. So yeah, if anyone's got any questions, can you put them in the chat box for Anna? I was really interested in, I know it was a feasibility trial and there wasn't really comparisons, but do you have any sense of how that intervention compared with maybe more standard forms of providing stammering intervention for this group in particular, who have maybe had, a series of, one-to-one interventions with speech therapists, for example?
Yeah, I think, speaking from my own clinical experience, I think that it just seems to be quite a profound experience going on the residential. I know young people just really had time to bond with other young people on the course, and they had the outdoor activities were just this really incredible experience where young people were just kind of pushing themselves to try new things. So I feel, to be honest, from my own perspective, it's quite hard to recreate that kind of situation in a clinical setting. But I think it certainly would be useful to compare. That's what I would really like to do for the next round of the study, really, is to compare usual intervention, whatever that might be, because that's quite variable, with the residential. So that's what I'm planning, but we just have to keep fingers crossed for funding.
Yeah, fantastic. And on a sort of similar but different note, I was kind of interested by your qualitative interviews. So did what you learned from those teenagers tell us any more about their experience of stammering? I was quite interested with that person saying that they almost owned their stammer, and I was just wondering, is that something that you've heard before from other either young people that you've worked with or from research that you're familiar with?
Yeah, I think it was just so nice to hear those quotes from the young people and really capture their voices. I think one of the things that interested me was the young person talking about the benefits of stuttering, and that's something it's gaining much more momentum, and we're talking about that lots more in our clinical therapy and in our clinic sessions as well. And it's these kind of new conversations around different ways of viewing stammering, really. So I think that was really nice for those young people to be joining the conversation around stammering being a different and a valuable way of communicating. So that's something I'm definitely trying to incorporate into my therapy in a clinical setting as well. So it's lovely to hear those comments coming up in the interviews.
Great. Okay, any other questions from anyone? So from Caitlin, did you also talk to the parents of young people, and what did they think about the outcomes from the course?
Yeah, so within the remit of the study, I just didn't have time to do interviews with the parents as well, but that's something I'd like to do for future. But what we did do was we got some written comments from parents about the course. And I wasn't able to put them into this presentation either, just in terms of time, but a lot of the comments did reflect the themes from the young people themselves. So it was around sort of independence, confidence to communicate. One parent said 100% more confident, that the course was priceless. So there were all positive comments about the course, and parents, I think that's reflected really in their quantitative measures as well. But I think certainly in-depth interviews with parents would really help us to drill down and to understand from their perspective what's going on on the course as well, and the impacts of it, because they themselves also attend workshops. So I think it's useful for parents themselves and also for the young people.
Great, thank you. Yeah, and Caitlin said thank you, that's great. I think just one final quick question. I was just wondering, did you have any peer supporters on the group? Do you have sort of older people who were stammerers or are stammerers as part of the team from the Fluency Trust?
So every year the Fluency Trust invites a previous course participant to come back as a mentor, a peer mentor. So they attend the group therapy and the outdoor activities, and they're really there just to provide support and for young people to gain experience from, really. So yeah, it's really lovely that to involve previous course participants, and it's a really nice role for that young person to then come back and take part in the course in a different way.
Yeah, that's what I was wondering. That sounds fantastic. Thank you so much. That was really, really interesting, and what a fantastic opportunity, and every good luck to you with your future funding bids. We'd really like to hear more about how you get on with that.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks, Anna. Okay, so our next presentation is from Jenny Ray, who's going to tell us about a pathway to successful speech and language therapy interventions in mainstream primary schools. So over to you. Thank you very much, Jenny.
Thanks, Kath. Hi, everybody. So I'm just going to draw out some of the essential points of my research. It ended up being quite expansive, and I'd really invite anybody who might be interested. I'm working on my paper revisions at the moment, so if anyone did want to come in and do some peer reviews, I'd be terrifically grateful. So I'm going to focus on 3 essential points. What you can see here, it looks quite a busy screen. So part of our UCL requirements was to do an academic poster. So that's what I've got in this first slide, and then I've broken that down in the subsequent slides. So first I'll start with the background and my key aims. So I'm a Band 7 schools lead, speech and language therapist working in Hackney in North East London. I've worked in mainstream for about 13 years across quite a few different areas, so Hertfordshire, Oxfordshire, Staffordshire, and then in the last 6 or 7 years in London, and worked in really different numbers of schools as well. So as an NQT, I was actually in 15 schools, and then as a Band 7, I'm in 3, so that seems very unfair. But you know, I've experienced the full spectrum of what it is to be in mainstream. So I chose to focus on the effectiveness of our current service delivery model in schools. Obviously, I've only worked in certain locations, and I was really interested in trying to get a sense of what was going on nationally, bearing in mind it was only my master's study. I would like to start, some of the results were a bit challenging in terms of, I think, pointing to the fact that we have some real difficulties in a lot of settings and in services about what's going on, and that probably won't come as a surprise to lots of mainstream therapists. But I really wanted to emphasize and acknowledge just how incredibly hard I recognize everybody is working in mainstream. And I guess what I'm hoping to do with this study is contribute some small piece towards a positive step for how to improve our services. So back in 2008, when Burko did his report, It was noted then that SLTs are increasingly being asked to train and delegate their work to others, so typically teaching assistants in schools, rather than deliver interventions themselves. I'd hesitate to say that possibly that's become the status quo rather than something that's continually increasing at this point. At the moment, we're drawing a distinction between the delegation of therapy to appropriately trained members of the SLT workforce, so for example, SLT assistants or even students as well in your service, and then separating that from, say, upskilling the wider workforce, which would include those TAs and also teachers and SENCOs, and enabling parents and carers. And one of the points that I draw out in my paper is that unless you've got that holistic wraparound care where the TA is supporting in school, the parents supporting at home, you're able to come in regularly, if the practical responsibility of that therapy tends to fall upon one person, so for example, typically it is that teaching assistant, I'd say it still definitely classifies as delegation, and the Royal College have acknowledged that in the 2018 revision around delegation, that often it is going to non-SLTs now. The reason I emphasize those terms is with formal delegation, there's a certain amount of structured support that must come alongside it. So for example, particular amount of supervision and development and training, which is given, I think, within our services, but isn't necessarily given to people where we're delegating to education staff. That's a little bit outside our power and outside our remit, but it's just acknowledging that possibly the people who might need even more support and more structure aren't receiving it at the moment. So in exploring the literature, I identified significant gaps in the existing research. So there have been quite a few case studies, which are really fascinating to look at, looking at specific types of therapy or even specific agents of therapy. But there have been very few studies at an RCT, a randomized controlled trial level, about who's best placed to deliver those interventions in schools. There was actually quite a flurry of studies around 2009, 2010, but that's since gone a little bit quiet, probably possibly moved into different areas. And there's also very little empirical evidence to demonstrate whether that evidence base that exists has had a proper impact on practice so far. So I set myself the research task of getting to grips with some of those gaps with a particular focus on, I can move my slide now. I don't know if I have control, great, thanks. Particular focus on who are the main agents of therapy, and is this in line with the evidence base? What factors underpin SLT's decision-making when selecting agents? How are SLTs rating different agents of therapy across measures of success? And what support are agents being offered to facilitate successful outcomes? Next slide, please. Thank you. So secondly, how I carried out my research and what results it yielded. My method was as followed. So I collaborated with patient and public involvement focus groups. That was both face-to-face, pre-lockdown, and then online, a little bit pre, and then that happened to just slide into the lockdown period as well on my research website, which that was a whole separate talk that I gave recently, but it was a really interesting skill to develop to create a website, and actually much easier than I suspected. So I did that to refine my research subject and survey questions. So it was as relevant to children with SLCN and practicing SLTs as possible, and also had importantly, the input of parents, carers and families. I had 26 willing expert reviewers for the first draft of the survey that went out, and they gave me a lot of feedback, which I integrated. And I then had 11 pilot reviewers who gave me really important feedback to develop the survey further and make it fit for purpose. I then disseminated it as widely as possible. Apologies to those of you who might follow me on Twitter, who saw just a big burst of retweets around April, May time while the survey was going out. So I used Twitter mostly, and also tried on Facebook, but that was a bit less fruitful, and through the Royal College sends. And in all, I had 112 respondents from across the UK complete the survey, quite a wide geographical range, with a predominance in London and the South East, but definitely did have that range all over, probably the fewest from Wales and Northern Ireland. But, Responses yielded valuable information. I'm really grateful to everyone. I'm sure quite a few of you may have filled in the survey, so thank you very much. And was appreciative for everyone to share their views and experiences. So what did my research show? Go to the next slide, please. So a clear picture emerged. In terms of having a choice over who delivers interventions in schools, a full 57% of therapists didn't have a say. And of those 43% who did, only 14% reported that they always had a say, and only 33% felt very confident in making these decisions. So it's an interesting and perhaps surprising result given how frequently delegation occurs in schools, but not necessarily surprising to a practicing therapist who recognizes the restrictions that are present when you're in schools. But nonetheless, we have this very clear and very sage guidance that we should be having a voice about who's delivering our therapy if we're handing it over to somebody else. So let's have a look at support provided by SLTs. Thank you. Now, there was an interesting contrast that I drew out of the survey. So I had mostly quantitative questions and then just a few carefully selected qualitative questions. One of the qualitative questions is, what does a successful indirect therapy approach look like for you? What are the key ingredients of that approach? And when I analysed that, I did content analysis to look at that. And TA enthusiasm was reported to be the highest component. It stood out beyond any other thing that SLTs reported. So in contrast, SLT support was reported to be one of the lowest factors for therapy actually happening as planned in a different quantitative question. So bearing those facts in mind, if we have a look at this graph, so these were separate questions, but I've pulled them together in this one graph to kind of look at the journey. So from that initial training we would do for the approach through to the initial modelling, whether the SLTs felt they were able to model sufficiently, whether they were then observing those sessions, and whether they then fed back from the observations. I'll just point out there that the x-axis is capped at 60%, so that's not going up to 100 there. But we have got clear indications that not that much training is happening in the first instance, and that was within the last 2 years. That wasn't immediately prior to the therapy. Then quite a lot of modelling in the initial case is happening, and then there's this drop-off as we go through, which is really significant in terms of a lot of you will have read the paper by Ebbels and all that came out in 2019. And one of the things it really emphasised is that in order for us to be successful, we need to have that intensive initial training, and we also need to have really dedicated regular follow-up. And the word that used in that paper was fortnightly. So the implications, go on to the next slide, please. There wasn't a lot of evidence from the survey that I carried out of confident or collaborative decision-making about who's carrying out therapy in schools. So whether that's from TAs, SLTAs, parents, or otherwise. And that position does seem to contradict the guidance that currently stands from the Royal College, which, as the quote in the main poster there, does specify that agents to whom work is delegated must have the appropriate role, level of experience, and competence to carry it out. So thinking about that, let's briefly examine the checklist, which I think is really helpful for delegation of a task. Maybe those of you who work in schools, or perhaps any of you who delegate on some level to other people, it could be interesting just to consider one example in mind here. So the different questions. So is delegation in the best interests of the service user? Do you have the authority and the appropriate clinical knowledge yourself to delegate the work? That came up in the survey too. The situation where when going into mainstream schools as a very consultative level, possibly even as an NQP or a relatively junior band 5, there's a certain expectation of your own experience. And it was drawn out in a survey that happened in 2012 as well from City with Pring et al., where therapists were often, modeling and trying to train in things that they hadn't had a lot of experience themselves in delivering or being trained in. So have you considered the clinical risk involved if things don't happen as planned, if things go wrong? does that person, this is the point I drew out in the poster, have the skills, knowledge and competence required to undertake the activity? Sometimes they really did. And there were some incredibly positive results that came out of the survey as well, which I maybe haven't emphasized as much in this poster, but there were some great examples of dedicated speech and language TAs who were doing a fantastic job where collaboration was really high and there were lots of successful outcomes. But unfortunately, with the restrictions, the funding restrictions and the practical resourcing that a lot of therapists are dealing with, that can be really difficult. Does the person have the capacity to take on additional work? I sometimes wonder whether we even think very hard about just the sheer volume of work that's already anticipated that those teaching assistants will carry out, or what happens for a parent. Thank you. What happens for a parent between the hours of 4 and 7? And also, can you provide adequate support and supervision? So this is one where this is about formal delegation. So this is suggesting more that SLTA, but at the same time, maybe another question is somebody providing adequate support and supervision to those members of staff in schools? Okay, next slide, please. So the take-home message. My study with 112 participants reveals that the current model that we're using in schools in many cases is not working effectively. And I will emphasize that that's based on data from the sort of dedicated speech and language therapists who are willing to complete a 55-question survey. So we worked really hard to kind of draw it down and make it as concise as possible, but it wasn't a quick survey. So those were really committed individuals. An analysis of my data points to a range of different proposals. You can spot where I ran out of space a little bit at the bottom of the poster, but just to briefly, to find ways to improve that collaborative decision making when selecting agents of therapy. And I've gone into a bit more detail in the paper itself. Think about actively building enthusiasm for speech and language based interventions in schools. So we've got some real pioneers emphasizing how we can enthuse children, but what if we also think about how we can enthuse teaching assistants? And also to develop robust pathways to improve training and support. I'm not suggesting this is easy, but I think there's a lot of factors that in various services we can think about. For example, do the people running the training have sufficient knowledge and skills themselves in the subject, in delivering training? Are we making sure our training is standing out so the schools want more of it? Also, some other quick tips, like videoing your sessions and sharing those. So that's like an ongoing, a bit like we're doing it much more now. We've almost hit this unintended new tech age. But are we doing that? And very few people reported that they were, even though TAs emphasized in focus groups, they'd love that. So those are the main highlights. I'd love to hear anyone who has any questions. And thank you very much for listening. Thanks, Kath.
Thank you very much, Jenny. That was really fascinating. It took me back when I first qualified. I did some work in mainstream schools a very, very long time ago. We didn't really have particular, models as such. So, and as a newly qualified therapist, I was definitely winging it a bit. But actually, I remember really clearly the people that I interacted with in schools were always the Senkos. So I found it really interesting that actually that's devolved now to teaching assistants being the main people that you're interacting with in terms of providing therapy in schools.
Yeah, I would say, the Senkos are definitely still our main point of contact, but don't usually have a lot of capacity to deliver any interventions themselves.
Yeah. Ailish was asking if it would be, she said it would be interesting to know what the barriers to delivering more training and support to TAs were from, a school or speech language therapy service-based, whether they're personal factors. Do you have any thoughts about that?
I think it was some personal factors, and like I emphasised before, there was a real range of reported experiences, which is why it's quite interesting then to look at the hard numbers on a graph. I think perhaps unsurprisingly, time was emphasized as one of the biggest factors. I'm very conscious that, we're possibly about to hit another recession. So one of the things I was trying really hard not to do in reflecting on my research and in writing it up and thinking about recommendations, even though I'm a very keen advocate for more speech and language therapy, but was to suggest that what we need is more funding and more time, because I think we could all get on board with that, and that's a message that's going out hopefully like loud and clear. But I think one of the clear elements around confidence in things like support and that delivery and training, definitely there was a marked correlation, a really strong correlation between banding and that level of confidence. That probably doesn't come as a surprise, but I wonder how much we're factoring that in. I mean, you gave an example, Kath, of going in as an NQP, and similarly I went in as an NQP, and I think I think there's some interesting things to examine about whether we put really junior therapists out into schools, or whether they, I know in some services, for example, they definitely start much more in clinical settings and then might gradually build up into school settings later. Not suggesting it's more difficult in some ways, but possibly challenging on certain levels.
Yeah, and I do think across the profession we sometimes have difficulties sometimes in identifying what our expert skills are, and if they're really practical. I'm having lots of conversations about this in terms of ACPs. If they're quite practical, skill-based stuff, like doing a sort of fees type thing if you're an adult therapist, or sort of very specific type of intervention, it's quite easy to define it. But if you're talking about building enthusiasm and having the confidence to enthuse and motivate others, how do you capture that? Is that an expert skill? It kind of feels like maybe it is, but how do we make that really part of our job descriptions and our sort of highly specialist skill kit toolkit?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's something we're really examining in our service at the moment, and it feels like there's two elements. There's one, that you have enough experience and confidence in what you're delivering, because it feels like enthusiasm from our side is always going to have those things as a foundation, because otherwise you're pretty nervous and you're not entirely sure, when you're responding to things. But the other side is about those skills. We have a lot of information out there now about delivering, exquisite presentations, and looking at all of the psychology around presenting. And I actually think as SLTs, we're in a prime position. Like many people are there already because we are communication experts. But I also think for a lot of us, myself included, to take that leap forward wouldn't take a lot of extra training. So I think it's something really interesting to look at. Yeah,
I completely agree. So there are a couple of extra questions here. One's from Helen. So their findings about who has a say in delegation decisions was really interesting. I wondered if those who said no, do you think they have a sense of who is making the decisions? Was it decided as a policy in organisations? Is it the SENCO? Is it something to do with the speech and language therapy service? Who's sort of deciding on delegating?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question, and I sort of wish I dug a bit deeper into that. I didn't ask any specific responses around that, and I suppose in some ways the question was posed, like, I know from all of my experience that that question was drawn from our guidance, not necessarily a suggestion from experience, that things other than availability and knowledge and skills of the person are going to be the highest factors. Certainly, like, availability in a separate question was reported by 90% of respondents as being one of the prime drivers for why that, and I think, to me, that in some ways that's just a marker that says it all. The fact that we're handing things over to the most available member of staff, but knowledge and skills was definitely a factor too.
Okay. There is another question from Lucy in the chat box, and Jenny, I might just ask you to respond to that separately, and a couple of people who are interested in seeing your recommendations. So if there is a paper or further publications, perhaps you could share those too.
Yeah,
I'm keen that we move on, because I want to make sure we leave enough room for our final speaker. So thank you very much, Jenny. That was absolutely fascinating. And moving on to Lydia, who is going to present on clinical data for children with speech sound disorders. So thank you, Lydia.
Thanks, Kath. Hiya, I'm from the Bristol Speech and Language Therapy Research Unit, and did this piece of work with Yvonne Wren, who's the director of the unit. So we looked at 3 different clinical sites in terms of the clinical data that they had available for children with speech sound disorder. Next slide, please. In terms of some background, we know that children with speech sound disorder are the largest group referred to speech and language therapy. I know that the prevalence estimates are around 3.6% for children who are aged 8 years old. We know that children with speech sound disorder who have a persistent difficulty, particularly once they reach school age, they're at risk of poorer outcomes later on in terms of education, employment as well, among other things. This overlaps quite a lot actually with some of the things that Jenny raised. We know that therapy for children with speech sound disorder is maybe not even just sometimes, it's often delivered by teaching assistants and speech and language therapy assistants. And certainly there was a survey study by Hegarty in 2017, I think it was, of 165 therapists, and they found that more than 90% of therapists reported that they always or sometimes worked with teaching assistants, and it was around 60% worked with speech and language therapy assistants, so it's quite high rates. But we don't have great evidence for these approaches, so we certainly have some evidence about the effectiveness, or the efficacy rather, of speech and language interventions for speech sound disorder. In research studies, in well-controlled studies, we have less evidence in practice in the clinical setting, where the roles of other people and time constraints, etc., come in. Next slide, please. Thanks. So the main aim of our study really was to compare how patterns of service delivery look. So whether speech therapy delivered by speech and language therapists versus those delivered by assistants had any difference in outcomes. That was our aim. So yes, we did. We looked at 3 different sites, and we audited case notes where children were between the age of 4 years and nearly 9 years old. They had to have what we kind of defined as a moderate speech sound disorder, which was essentially that they met the threshold for requiring speech and language therapy, that they had no pervasive other difficulties, and they had received a block of speech and language therapy. Next slide, please. It's quite a busy slide, this one, sorry, but so like I said, there was 3 sites. We did a slightly different approach because we were able to benefit from one of our collaborators doing an extensive audit in her trust. And so for site A, we looked at the most recent block of therapy, and for site B and C, we looked at all the available blocks of therapy. So so what we were left with was 174 sets of case notes that we looked at altogether, but within that 234 blocks of therapy, because for site B and C there were multiple blocks of therapy within those case notes that we audited. You can see here that essentially there was different models at the different sites. So for example, site A therapy was most commonly delivered by teaching assistants for the blocks that we looked at. For site B, there was quite a mixture in terms of who was primarily delivering the intervention, and for site C, most of the therapy was delivered by speech and language therapists. So there was quite a range in how therapy was delivered across the sites that we looked at. Next slide, please. So unfortunately, the data essentially was quite limited in terms of what it was able to show us. So this slide demonstrates how much intervention data there was before the therapy block and how much there was after. So for all of the sites, there was more pre-intervention assessment, and for all of them, there was less at post-intervention. But the availability of there being both pre-intervention assessment and post was really low. So we only intended to audit data where there was a transcribed speech sample. And out of the 234 blocks of therapy, there was only 33 in which there was assessment data within 1 month of block of therapy, so within 1 month before and after it. If we increased that time period to 3 months, then we had 60 case notes that had audit data, but still that left 173 where there just wasn't adequate before and after data. Thank you. Next slide, please. So essentially, unfortunately, with our aims of originally comparing the different methods of service delivery, it wasn't possible from the data that was available. When we kind of cross-mapped how much intervention data there was within the adequate time period, and across the intervention groups there was essentially none for some of the intervention groups, and the data just really lacked. We also found that there was a wide range of assessments that were being used. There was also a lack of information on the number of sessions when interventions were delivered in schools, so the case notes didn't have clear data about how often the sessions were being delivered, or how long they were, or even what they were focusing on. There was also quite a few cases where different assessments were used at the beginning and at the end of therapy. And as I've already explained, the time point in which the assessment data was collected was very variable and often not necessarily close to the block of therapy. So there was a total of 10 different assessments that were used across the 3 sites, and 5 of these were published screening tools that you might have heard of before. The DEEP is the only one that's a standardized assessment, and there was another 5 assessments that we identified as well, but they can be categorized as informal pitch and naming assessments, like the Bowen Quick Screener, but a lot of them were kind of in-house variations of assessments, and it wasn't always clear where the origins of the assessments were. So this is just an example from one of the sites. In terms of as I mentioned, all of the sites tended to have less outcome data or intervention assessment data at the end of the block of therapy. And that was because a lot of them tended to look at the data in terms of, look at the child in terms of whether they had achieved their targets. So it would be things like they are able to name and they are able to use S initial in sentences in up to 4 words, for example, rather than having transcribed data. So that was that kind of like a functional, pragmatic assessment rather than an independent or objective transcript and sample of the child's speech that many of the therapists seem to be using. Next slide. So, you know, when we looked at all of this, although clearly there is an issue in terms of trying to compare data when there are lots of different assessments being used, it's not necessarily the assessments which are important per se, it's about having adequate transcript data. So obviously we need transcripts to look at error patterns analysis in terms of, and we can use things like phoneme inventories and percentage consonants correct. And those are really important in terms of both establishing differential diagnosis for speech sound disorder, but also in determining the intervention approach and the targets that are being used. Although we don't have explicit guidelines on what we should be assessing for speech sound disorder, the Child Speech Disorder Research Network does have 2 guidelines that support speech and language therapists in transcription and analysis of children's speech. But we found that wasn't really being followed. So, for example, as well, many of the therapists, where they were using an assessment, if there was kind of an analysis or scoring sheet, that wasn't often used. It was rarely used, and where some therapists were kind of doing a visual analysis, but that was also kind of hit and miss and only some of the time. So we would argue what is important is not necessarily the exact assessments, but we certainly need representative transcribed samples, and rather than a checklist. And we also need to know how tools compare in the samples they yield, and how the data is interpreted. And we know that that's something that's possible with tools like phonetic phonological system analysis, and that we can combine different types of data as long as we have an adequate transcribed sample. Next slide, please. So with all that, as I said, we don't have a national standard for collecting data at the moment, and we think that the need for a minimal data set for children with speech sound disorder is really important, and it would hold real value in allowing us more routine evaluation. And I think that's really important, not just for examining how effective specific interventions are, but how effectively are different pathways that are so common in speech therapy and different in different trusts in terms of who's delivering the therapy, you know, it would actually give us that data to evaluate whether they're actually working in practice. And obviously we're fortunate to work in a health system like the like the NHS, which, you know, could combine really large data sets and really kind of put us in a really valuable position to essentially manage to get really good data on this if we were measuring the right things or similar things. And I think that's it. So just to summarize, we know it's unclear how effective speech sound disorder interventions are in practice, especially when very different pathways are being used. And certainly from the case notes that we evaluated at the 3 trusts in this study, it's very much indicated that we're not recording data consistently, and we're not doing it in the time frame that's close enough to a block of therapy to really enable us to evaluate the blocks of therapy. So there's a lack of consistency, and there's too much variation in terms of when that data is being collected. And more robust data collection within clinical practice would enable more routine evaluation. And as I said, we really think that a minimal data set and an agreement about what would be important in that data set could help move things forward. And I think it would be really important for researchers to work collaboratively with clinicians about something that's feasible to do in practice, that also fulfills the criteria that we need in terms of generating robust and reliable or rather representative transcripts of the children's speech. And just a quick note to say thank you also that we had help from other people in terms of data collection and advice for this project. And welcome any questions.
Thank you, Lydia. That was brilliant, really interesting. And it was a sort of nice transition to move on from, we know TAs are offering therapy, but does it, you know, is it as effective? And we don't have the data to answer that question, which is, I think, something that we struggle with quite a lot across our profession. I was in a meeting this morning where I was trying to persuade my colleagues to collect therapy outcome measures data more consistently. We're getting lots of baselines, but not much in terms of outcomes. Resonated really strongly with your study here. And one of the main bits of feedback was, well, we're kind of not motivated to do it when we don't know how it's going to be used. We never necessarily see it. And it's interesting because often we try to do maybe these studies looking at this retrospective data. So I was sort of saying, well, it'd be really useful to be able to compare our video online based interventions now with what we were providing previously face to face, but we don't have the data because we don't have the outcome measures from previously, let alone now. But obviously we're seeing that in retrospect, if you see what I mean. So there's something about a carrot for therapists in the moment, like, you know, what do they need in order to be motivated, with no disrespect to therapists. I know there's all sorts of different tasks to complete in terms of administration when you're doing notes, but really what can we make sure is that sort of instant feedback thing, that they know that that's going to be really key. You know, that minimal data set's going to be really key to get complete in order that we can make it really useful for everybody.
Definitely.
All right, does anybody have any questions for Lydia about that? Did you get any sense from your collaborators or the people that you were collecting the data from, that you're doing the audits on, as to whether, you know, there'll be any change in terms of their data collection, their case notes in response to you not being able to complete?
I think there was variability. I think some people maybe didn't fully recognize how limiting the data was. I think there was maybe an expectation from us that the data from a research perspective wasn't likely to be amazing, but yeah, I know, you know, one of the trusts was just really proud of all the work they were doing, and that they were doing lots of speech therapy based work, which is great, but it was almost quite difficult kind of giving the feedback that actually there's not much usable data from to do a proper analysis of, and I think it's marrying those two worlds, isn't it, that what people use that maybe feels pragmatic or you know, on a day-to-day basis with selecting targets, maybe works for clinicians but isn't quite robust enough, or we can't see the kind of the process of how they've done that, or to measure its impact and effectiveness just isn't, the data isn't there for us to do that. But I think it's hard when there's no overall guideline or minimal idea, and that there's so many variations in trusts in terms of both what they do on the ground, all these different pathways, and the interventions available, and the assessments available. There's just masses of variability, and it almost feels like maybe we do need, if we had a minimal data set, maybe that would encourage clinicians that this is something that there's a minimum standard that we need to be aiming for, that we do need to get our assessments in within these certain time frames, and that people would kind of see the value of that a bit more, like you say.
So a couple of comments coming in. So Helen was saying there's such a good use of audit to highlight practices which will hopefully lead to improvement. So actually that in itself, this audit is that the outcome is you kind of need to change what you're doing in order that we can actually answer the question we're trying to answer. Any further questions for Lydia? Oh, I think we're just about to be cut off. It's 1 o'clock already. Oh my goodness. So before we get completely cut off, any more questions to Lydia, please direct them via the Bristol Speech Therapy Research Unit or Lydia's email address. Thank you all very much for joining us today. Again, I've obviously been carried away with how interesting it all is because we've run out of time. If anyone's is watching and is interested in presenting today, or knows someone who might be, we have got a slot in our December session, which will be on the 9th, I think. I can't see because my picture's in the way, the 9th of December. So please get in touch with Helen or myself if you know anyone who's been doing some interesting practice inspired projects, which will help to give to fill our space in our sort of festive seminar next month. So thanks once again, and we'll look forward to seeing you all next month. Thank you.